So guys, this has been on my mind for a few days. Watching this one video that Sean Chandler put out when he was talking about how if Marvel has ruined blockbusters as of late. Big mistake on my part. I scrolled down to the comments section and I was beyond furious by some of what I was reading. Not necessarily what Sean Chandler was talking about, mind you, but what his fans were saying below. Two comments that stuck out to me, saying something like, Martin Scorsese's comments on Marvel have aged like fine wine, or that the MCU needs to go away and die for real cinema to come back. I don't want to get too heated on here, but needless to say, I was pretty livid reading that. I said, okay, I can't take this anymore. I gotta say something about this. Now, my stance on MCU post-Endgame, I've already said what I needed to say. You could check out some of my previous reviews. I'll put the links in the description for you. But what I really wanted to focus on was Martin Scorsese's comments on, well, maybe not so much that, because a lot of people have talked about it, and nothing that I could say can really add anything else to the table, because I don't really disagree with him that there is a certain type of focus that Hollywood is putting on the big blockbuster and franchise and comic book movie culture, whereas back in his prime, when he made movies like Raging Bull, Taxi Driver, or Goodfellas and Casino, we don't really see that kind of cinematic landscape anymore. Well, at least not in the ways that it used to be. You'd have to do a lot of digging to find that stuff. But as far as the mainstream focus, it's mostly like this big franchise property type of approach. And that's just the way Hollywood has gone in the last 20 plus years. Whether or not you think it's for the worse or the better, that's another discussion. I've heard some other people say this, but things are just simply changing. They're not necessarily changing for the worse. We'll know in time whether or not it was for the worse or for the better. But something that Scorsese said that really stuck out to me, and I've seen other people respond to this in agreement with him. Certain people, like Chris Nolan, need to fight back against the franchise and comic book movie culture to preserve actual cinema. I'm not going to mention any names, but I've seen quite a few YouTubers who actually fall in line with this line of thinking that comic book movies need to just go away and never come back in order for real cinema to thrive like it was back in the good old days of cinema. Well, they're kind of getting what they're asking for, because this past year, 2023, if it's any indication, audiences are craving something different. Now, there's been all these types of talks about whether or not the Marvel brand is dying, which it's actually not. As far as I'm concerned, it's just going through a rough patch right now, and Marvel is trying to course correct a lot of the stuff that they've been doing. And just a little sidebar here, I am going to try to check out Echo eventually, but it's something that's been kind of bothering me for a few years. After seeing the comment section on Sean Chandler's one video, I had to say something, because Chris Nolan, I think, had a more reasonable outlook on this whole thing, on what the solution would be. If you're someone who aligns with Scorsese, to me, that's not exactly a fair way to have the different type of variety that you want. Now, mind you, this is just my own personal opinion. I'm not an expert on filmmaking or how the industry is run, nor do I know everything about cinematic history as a whole. I'm just speaking from my own observation on what I've seen over the past couple of years, especially since Scorsese made those comments some time ago. The idea of pushing back against comic book movies and franchise movie culture to not include them at all, I think is a really great disservice to the people that are making those things, because, you know what, I don't care if I'm going to get hate for this. Those are films too. That's part of cinema. Cinema is not the same way that it used to be. I know it's really easy to say something like Scorsese is just some old head who's longing for the past glory days of cinema, and I understand where he's coming from, and people like Spielberg and Tarantino will more than likely share some of those sentiments. And I'm really tempted to say to those guys, look, this is just the way things are going. Things are going to change. It's not always going to be the same way. And if it was, we'd inevitably be craving for something different. And if we go back to the way it was and never allowing those types of movies to be shown ever again or even made, then inevitably people would start to crave for those too. I could go on and on about that. The bottom line is that Chris Nolan's approach on how the industry should approach franchises and smaller indie films, this I think is probably the way we should go. I mean, everybody likes to heap praise on Scorsese's comments. I actually think Chris Nolan had the right idea instead. In an interview with the Associated Press while promoting Oppenheimer, he stressed the importance of originality in filmmaking while also believing that there is a need for blockbusters based on pre-existing IP. Quote, "There's always been a balance in Hollywood between established titles that can assure a return in the audience and give more people of what they want. That's always been a big part of the economics of Hollywood, and it pays for a lot of the other types of films to be made and distributed." And he goes on to say, but there also always has to be a respect for the audience's desire for something new. That's one of the big thrills of going to the movies. Frankly, seeing a trailer for a movie you've never heard of, or a type of movie that you haven't seen. A healthy ecosystem in Hollywood is about a balance between two things, and it always has been. Close quote. He's all for originality, clearly, but he's also not against big franchises as well. He's gone on record saying that he loves Star Wars. The the original Star Wars. That was one of his biggest inspirations in cinema. And that's not something that you would really hear from a guy like Chris Nolan. And he even talked high praise about Richard Donner's Superman from 1978. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but he praised Robert Downey Jr.'s portrayal of Iron Man in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You could say that he was only doing it for the camera, that he actually doesn't like those movies. Whether or not any of that is actually true, I actually think Chris Nolan had the better idea. I'm someone who likes to have a middle ground approach on basically anything in life. I mean, there's some things that I do lean one way more so than the other way, but most of the time, I think it helps to have a mushy middle ground. And if you ask me, in today's day and age, that is a lost art form. In the case of taking a stance against big franchises in the MCU, where there's so many Martin Scorseses walking around throwing a bunch of rocks their way, be someone like Chris Nolan. That goes a long way. You may not get as much attention, and he doesn't really seem to be getting much attention for what he said, but it's something that I think people should pay more attention to. Not trying to throw any shade towards Scorsese, but I'm just saying, Nolan, I think, had the right idea. So what are you guys' thoughts on this topic? Let me know down below what they are, respectfully if you would. Either way, just let me know down below, and as always, see you in the next one.